So I'm going to invite each in turn, starting with Joanne, to speak for about 5 minutes or so about their hopes, the future that they envisage. Joanne.
Thanks ever so much, Rachel. And thanks for inviting me to speak to this conference. It's been an absolutely fascinating day with a really collaborative and positive zeitgeist, which I think is really encouraging. I want to talk to an issue that I think has come up a lot in the day, which is the contrast between personalisation and standardisation. And I want to speak to how important I think personalisation is, but also including the topic of AI and perhaps putting forward quite a dystopian future that brings us back to thinking about what matters and the things that we have through standardisation and ways that we're going to have to think about this disruptive technology of AI. Because essentially, we've been talking, as I said, very collaboratively, as though we all have the same values. Well, we don't. Education is essentially a values-based political project of society building, and we all have different views about how we should go about this. And amongst that are ed tech people and computer scientists who have their own views about what counts as learning and what counts as valuable learning. So there's something in that I think we need to be really, really cautious about. My first job as a graduate was in artificial intelligence at the Institute of Aviation Medicine in Farnborough. It's where they have all the air shows. And AI in those days was absolutely crap. You didn't even do voice recognition, and certainly not a Scottish accent. You could do the numbers 1 to 9 if you had a standard pronunciation. But we were thinking a lot about what it could mean for the future. So I went to work for the exam board, which I can tell you was much more exciting, by the way. It was much more interesting, the education project. And I went to see my boss and I said, look, I'm reading all this stuff, this review by Dave Bartram at Savile and Holdsworth. He's the top guy, and he's telling us that digital technology is going to be the basis of exams in the next 10 years. And he said, let me see that paper, and it was 1994. And he said, well, here's one from 1984. The guy said the same thing. So there's a question about why it hasn't moved more quickly that I think a lot of people have taken an interest in. So we know that also when we've had digital technology, it's tend to replicate the kinds of assessments that we saw before. It hasn't been very transformative. And we've been watching and waiting for this to come along. So the experience has been of sitting in the same exam halls that we've had for actually hundreds, 1,000 years in China. So there's been a question about when will we see transformation, and I really like this Redeker and Johansson paper of 2013, because basically they say the same thing as everybody else, any time now. But they had a graph that I've been laughing at for years when I've been teaching this, which essentially said, about 2025, this will all change. I'm not laughing anymore, because we're seeing something really quite different now. What we're seeing is a disruptive technology that's been taken up at scale that's likely, so I mean generative AI, but there are other forms, as Rose Luckin mentioned earlier. So where does this take us then? Well, we can see what happened in other industries like music or communications when these disruptive technologies came along that were so attractive. They offered features that we didn't have before. The user experience was so much better that they undercut the whole industry model and upended it. What happened then too was that all of these industries, if you look at them, became less under national control, not even just under the same commercial controls. That transferred too. But they also left us with issues of transparency and issues with regulation. Just try and get a hold of your phone company these days to get anything sorted. So Ofqual has also been actually, in all fairness to them, trying to provoke the industry to have more digital assessments. They had competitions about producing digital assessments and so on. It's actually been part of their policy for quite a long time. But they also were looking at, well, what's preventing us here? So they produced a really interesting report on the barriers to large-scale digital assessment of the kinds that they regulate. There's lots there, the lack of infrastructure in schools, digital divides, all of the things that we're quite familiar with. But their model is the standardised model. It's not a personalised assessment model. So it's a well-trodden path that's been really well resourced. Regulations have been set up around it. And it's underpinned by issues about beliefs of what counts as fairness, which we've heard different views about today, about what counts as validity, where your emphasis is there, the importance of reliability, having a standardised assessment that's the same wherever you go, different schools and so on. There are issues of manageability, the utility of the qualifications, they have to have a purchase in the society, the cost of them and so on. But this is the dystopia that I want to take you to. In other industries where this disruptive technology has come in, it's cut across all of these things. So the relevance of the old structures fell away, which means that if big tech decided to start introducing assessments and tutoring systems that were actually really attractive, that assess the kind of things that we think are important, that employers think are important, rather than these traditional standardised disciplinary-based approaches that we've had. So if we really were very personalised and digital, and it was taken up at scale, then people like Ofqual and the exam boards are just far less relevant. In fact, the government has far less control over big tech as well. So if those were really the routes into employment and were accepted by universities and so on, everything changes. So be careful what we ask for around this, is really the sorts of thoughts that I've been having about this, because where are the regulations then, and where's the transparency? Who's deciding what the values are that underpin an assessment like that? So I think we need to be, and I know Rose Luckin also does this, by the way, we need to be thinking ahead about what those structures would be that continue to make the assessments something that we think are important, because there isn't an assessment that is independent from the kinds of learning that you get. They come together. The format, the way they're operated, and your instruments of assessment are deeply connected with how people teach and learn. So that's where we'd be heading with that. We'd be putting all of our money into something that perhaps educationalists were not involved in. I'm sorry if I'm offending anybody, but here we go. Have you spoken to a computer scientist who does the learning analytics and what they think learning is? Really strange conversations they are. It doesn't correspond to anything that I understand as learning, or even the kind of values that I would have. So I worry about those learning analytic models paired with psychometrics that come up with an outcome that I don't understand or particularly value. So our traditional methods of creating the things the constructs, the things that we're assessing, are through theory, empirically driven, what we know people can do, subject matter based, using expertise through subject matter experts and teaching experts, or politicians have decided for us, policy driven. But the future adds another one, which is this learning analytics model, which I think is needs questioning. That's and tight control, I think. So I think there are various questions that this raises for us, and I will stop.
You're okay, fine.
The curriculum could be less constrained, and I think that's really something valuable, that's really interesting, that we could perhaps be assessing all sorts of characteristics of individuals, like leadership skills that are quite difficult to assess. I mean, that's one I've plucked out of the air, but there's a whole range of things, team working, that might be easier to assess using digital technologies and the sorts of technology that might be coming in over the next few years. But who defines the content? What is valuable learning to these people? Where are the quality checks on it? Who owns the data? Do we have any privacy around this? Is everything I've ever done going to be on my learning certificate? Am I effectively being surveilled by these technologies? And we know the danger of that is absolutely yes, because okay, I'm a professor at Oxford, but there have been a few failures along the way that I don't want any of you to know about. And that's how I learned. And it's really important. And we haven't all been successful in all of the things that we've done. That's just a model we have. And looking backwards, it looks as if we have, but lots of us have needed to go over the hurdle a few times. We've got about to have so one question is, under a model like that, what counts as learning? And we were talking about this earlier today too, that the AI can do so much for us. It's kind of got the knowledge content. So what are we going to define as learning, and what's the important thing that the human's doing under those circumstances? We've got a special issue of the Oxford Review of Education coming out, and Patricia is actually based on Patricia Broadfoot's work, who's a sociologist of assessment. And she adds something new, I think. She talks about what we're going to need in the future is something she calls connoisseurship. So people are going to have to be able to look at the kind of information they're being presented with and understand how to value that. And that's a different kind of process. It's about evaluating the kinds of material that they're being presented with, and God knows, I think we're all already challenged with that with ChatGPT. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. I'm going to move straight over to Bill, and then we might tease out some common threads or some sort of dissonance between both of your expositions. Bill.
Thank you, Rachel. I really like the idea of connoisseurship. I can immediately see there's some kinship there. I've got three large hopes and an ill-organised cluster of mini hopes, and I'm going to just share those with you. One builds off the back of Sammy's reminder that we need to think about what the point of school is. It's something that I and my colleague Guy Claxton have been doing forever, and I think you need to keep asking that question. And I think the moment you think you've cracked it, you haven't. And I think you were asking it from the perspective of an underserved set of users. I tend to ask it from a breadth perspective, but there are lots of dimensions, I think, of asking that would be really relevant. The second is, I think it would be wonderful if, not just in this room, because we've done very well at this, if we could move beyond the nonsensical binary discussions about what matters in education. And I think particularly, is it knowledge or is it capabilities, dispositions and skills? And of course it's both, isn't it? And we all know that, but we too often refuse to have an elegant conversation about that. That was the image I had of the Andy Goldsworthy sculpture in my head. And the third is that I hope this movement continues to thrive. It seems to me we're beyond institution. We're a really healthy mix of academics, system leaders, school leaders, practitioners, not-for-profits, business folk, parents, random folk who've wandered in off the street and felt that Manchester is a pretty nice place these days to be. And I hope we move into a next phase, not just of shaping, but making. I think we've done some pretty effective shaping. And I think now in some cases we need some really powerful empirical evidence for what we've been articulating. And some of the questions need to get more nuanced. So for example, on a learner profile, what gets validated or warranted internationally, what nationally, what regionally, what locally, and what not at all? These are big questions, and I think we need to start to think of those at the same time as getting more people to build them. And now it just gets a bit random. So sparing Joanne's blushes, obviously I hope the curriculum assessment review comes up with all of these answers, but I suspect that they won't. And indeed, in a private conversation, which will therefore remain private, I suspect that Joanne may even, although of course she's too dignified to say so, not all of her dreams will happen. But I hope that the curriculum assessment review or others will recognise the key importance of some of the dispositions and capabilities we've been talking about. I think interestingly in Scotland, with the Skills 4.0 frame, there is an overlap between those things that might be considered to be important to employers and vocational pathways and those in schools. And we've not got that south of the border. I think we've got something a little bit closer in Skills Builder, and I'm really enjoying conversations with John and others at Pearson about how we might bring together the underpinning dispositions that sit in project qualifications, that sit in some of the vocational pathway qualifications, and bring those together into one handy compendium. I think we have to think more about rebalancing summative and formative, and those shouldn't be seen as silly oppositions. We've got to be clear what it is we're evidencing. I think the language itself about assessment, we tend to leap to measure or assess when we might choose to say evidence.